All right, good evening and an early happy holidays. Welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the inaugural Bernard William Vann Fellow in Christianity and the Armed Forces here at Durham University, as well as Executive Director of the ICMI. And I'm glad that each of you has joined us tonight, as I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sara de Jong from the University of York for her presentation From Moral Injury to Moral Redemption, Afghanistan Veterans Advocacy on behalf of Afghan interpreters. Sara is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. Since 2017, she's been researching the claims to protection and rights by Afghan interpreters and has investigated the strategies of their advocates, including veterans in the US, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So it is my honor to welcome Sara to our webinar and to turn things over to her. Sara.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming here tonight. As Brian already said, my name is Sara de Jong. I'm a professor in politics at the University of York in the UK. And I would first of all like to thank both Brian and Jane for the invitation and also the organization of this webinar. I also, as you can see on the slide, would like to credit photographer Andy Barnum, who himself is also an Afghanistan veteran, who did 2 tours in Afghanistan, for the images that you will see on the slides. As some of you may have seen already, if you have looked at my work, Andy and I have been working together for some time now, for some years, and we have created an exhibition on the experiences of Afghan interpreters who worked for the British Armed Forces and who subsequently got resettled to the UK. That exhibition is called We Are Here Because You Were There, Afghan Interpreters in the UK. But we have also subsequently started portraying and photographing the veterans that I have interviewed in my work. And actually, soon in spring in Bradford, we'll be starting to display in a gallery there, in the Impressions Gallery, some of the portraits that you will see here. And so I just want to credit him for his work and encourage you to check it out. So in terms of the context of my research, of course, the withdrawal of Afghanistan, of troops from Afghanistan, and then the subsequent takeover of the country by the Taliban in August 2021 is something that was really on everybody's radar, even if you had no awareness before, which I'm sure you already did, but even for people who had very little awareness before of what was happening in Afghanistan, those images of people kind of trying to clamber onto planes is something that, really sticks to, our consciousness, and is something that's resonated, of course, with many people. And for some people, Afghan interpreters only came into view at that particular moment. As those of you who have served in Afghanistan know, local interpreters play an essential role in the support of armed forces, and of course, in particular, in wars that claim to try and win the hearts and minds of local populations. It is absolutely impossible to do so without having local interpreters on the ground. Local interpreters are people who were not only translating, but of course also, in a sense, collected intelligence, gathered intelligence, mediated relationships with the local population, negotiated relationships, created cultural awareness among the troops. And so, in a sense, you could see them more broadly as mediators, brokers of sorts, in, of course, an incredibly contentious setting. I can say more about the broader research, but in the Q&A. But what is most important here, perhaps, is that I started in 2017 looking at how Afghan interpreters themselves, and I've also interviewed some Iraqi interpreters, how they themselves articulated their claims to protection and rights. And I also followed those people who became allies in their struggle. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, many of those allies were veterans, which is what brought me into contact with veterans. As Brian already said, the research wasn't concentrated on one specific country, because as we know, of course, the mission in Afghanistan was an international mission. And so I thought it was important to bring that broader perspective into view. And also, as some of you may know, Afghan interpreters tended to work, maybe 2 years for the US, then 1 year for the UK. So also from their perspective, it's important to have a kind of global framework in which we place their claims to protection and rights. I started initially in 2017 because I was interested in the historical repetitions of this particular issue. The local interpreters or local staff that is often, one could say, used and abused, absolutely indispensable, but also subsequently often expendable. And this is something that, those of you who have Vietnam on their minds could still probably remember in terms of local staff in Saigon trying to clamber onto helicopters in images not dissimilar to what we have seen in Afghanistan in 2021. But also if we go back further in time, during colonial wars, we have seen that local staff, of course, was absolutely essential to military conquest. And their situation was often very powerful, yet very precarious. And so as a political scientist, I was interested in looking at this particular position of the mediator, the broker, in very polarized settings and their position as political agents. Now, what I did when I did the research over the past 6 years, and what I continue to do, is to look at bases of political contention. So I followed any Afghan interpreter or Iraqi interpreter or ally who was managing to make noise about the lack of protection and the lack of rights of Afghan interpreters, which meant that they started following people who had set up self-organizations to support Afghan interpreters, and I will give some examples in a moment. I also started looking at people who staged protests. So there were also simultaneous protests, for instance, sometimes in Kabul at the embassy and let's say in France. I looked at people who were engaged in court cases, sometimes strategic litigation to force the state to set up resettlement policies. And so I really looked at where people managed to forge a space to get the story into the media, to make the voices of Afghan interpreters and their allies heard. The research, the data that I draw on, which you will see in the subsequent presentation, are partially semi-structured interviews with very prominent veteran activists in the UK, Australia, Canada, US, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Now, this, of course, seems a very small number, but what is important to note is that these were often the one or two single veteran activists who were the most prominent in each of those specific countries. So, for instance, in Germany, there was only one serving, actually, soldier who was extremely vocal in this debate. Similar in the Netherlands, there was just one. Of course, in the US and the UK, slightly bigger countries, there were maybe a handful of people. But this is prior to 2021. These are people who already anticipate or who already understand that there is an issue with the protection of Afghan interpreters, who are seen as traitors by the Taliban and who are therefore at risk, and who are already at that particular point kind of stepping out of the fold and very vocal about this issue. I also need to say that the idea of an interview is perhaps a little bit misleading to describe my research, because I stayed in touch with all of the people that I've interviewed, and I've continued to work alongside those people that I've interviewed. And I can say a little bit more about it in a moment. So the interviews are kind of complemented by participatory observation of political meetings, document analysis, of course, of any writing that they do, but also private correspondence, including with other veteran activists who are not included in those 14. Now, I imagine that some of you who are in the room who may themselves be veterans might have some questions about my own positionality. You may even have some skepticism in relation to whether a CIFI researcher like me, a civilian researcher like me, has any kind of understanding either of moral injury or of the particular situation that Afghan interpreters found themselves in. So maybe it is useful to say a little bit more about myself. I am indeed a civilian, and I come from the Netherlands. I live in the United Kingdom, as you have probably guessed. And I have quite a lot of experience in political organizing in relation to migration. And I have worked for a long time on people trying to do good. So perhaps different from other political scientists who really look at what goes wrong. I'm interested in people who try to do good. And I also try to make my research useful for those people who try to do good. And so I built relationship with the veterans that I interviewed. And one of the things that struck me was that they were often very isolated in their political engagement on behalf of Afghan interpreters. And they almost felt that, you know, they were like a lone voice in the desert. And so I started connecting them. So from 2018 and 2020, I started holding international workshops where I brought different veterans together. And most recently in May 2023, I again brought a lot of veterans together in Germany from all of those different countries to establish together an organization called Local Staff International that will actually advocate also in future conflict for the protection of local staff. In the UK, I, together with 3 veterans, set up an organization which advocates on behalf of Afghan interpreters who work for the British Army. That started as a very loose initiative in 2018-19, but grew into a charity, which I'm still chairing and an executive member of. So my engagement with veterans is almost on a daily basis. And so although I may not formally be part of the community and indeed will never understand or will never fully be able to access certain things, I'm in very, I can test my research, so to say, with the community that I work with. So the broader question then became, you know, what sparked and sustained veterans' activism concerning the protection and rights of Afghan interpreters, especially those who even started before August 2021. And here's an example of some of the organizations that I looked at. Some of you might be familiar with No One Left Behind in the US, the Sula Alliance, as I said, in the UK, of which I was a co-founder, Forsaken Fighters in Australia, the Mentor Network of Afghan local staff in Germany, or Veterans for American Ideals, a project of Human Rights First, Amalara in Canada. Each of those organizations was founded by a veteran. So all the people that I engage with and that I will share interview quotes of are people that either co-founded or were part of formal organizations or looser initiatives where they advocated as an individual. Most of them were not formal politicians. They didn't engage as a formal politician in elected parliamentary politics, but they engaged in the space of civil society, both to change the resettlement commitments of their countries, but also to do direct casework to support legal challenges, both in terms of protection through relocation, but also in the post-resettlement phase. Now, I want you to bear in mind that what I will present, of course, is no generalized account of all veterans experiencing moral injury. I'm really looking at a select group of very active soldiers and veteran advocates who even, as I said, before August 2021, came out in the public to advocate on behalf of Afghan interpreters. I also want to acknowledge that I understand that there are other soldiers and veterans who may feel very strongly about the protection of Afghan interpreters, but who may not have felt comfortable to speak out on this matter. Some people simply, after they came back from Afghanistan or from Iraq, try to get on with their life, which sometimes was challenging enough. They try to leave what they had left behind in Afghanistan behind. But there was, of course, also an institutional context that we need to acknowledge, where in general, the military wasn't encouraging people, soldiers and veterans, to stay in touch with their local staff members on the ground. So sometimes it meant that Afghan interpreters themselves felt that the friendships, the relationships, the brotherhood that they experienced in theaters of war was disrupted afterwards. So you have a quote here from a former Afghan interpreter who worked for the US forces, who fled initially to Norway, made it to the Netherlands, and has now refugee status there, who said, "We are friends in a difficult situation, but now we have left Afghanistan. No one knows us anymore. That's very strange for me. I would never do that. If I would work for defense or the NATO, I would protect my colleagues with my life. I would not be able to sleep peacefully. I don't know how they can sleep. If I see that my interpreter is in danger, believe me, I would not sleep. But none of them cares. And of course, we know that some people do care, but I just want to kind of give this broader context of how some Afghan interpreters feel, so that their voices are also in the room. So the following quote is from a Dutch veteran who became extremely vocal in the advocacy of Afghan interpreters. I actually say this wrong. He's not a veteran, he's still a serving soldier, and in that way he was even braver speaking out because, of course, as we know, there's a pressure on serving military personnel to not be overly political. He himself returned from Afghanistan before his own tour of duty ended because of an injury that he sustained in an attack. And during that attack, one of his colleagues died, and the interpreter who was present during that attack played a very important role in bringing people out. And he told me during the interview that every year at the anniversary of his comrade's death, he tries to mark the date in some way, and he found himself browsing Facebook to look at the place of where the accident happened, to try and make sense of his own experience, the fact that his friend had lost his life there. And he said, I suddenly saw on Facebook a picture of someone who looked very familiar, and the name also looked very familiar to me. So that was one of the interpreters. I was curious how he was doing. And then I actually waited like a week thinking, should I contact him or not? Is this wise? Because you're being warned about contacts in Afghanistan. So you see that there's an institutional context where the continuation of relationships between local staff on the ground and military personnel, international military personnel, may not always be encouraged, but there is a desire to an extent on both sides, at least for some people, to still maintain those relationships. So I have a few slightly formal slides before I go more into the kind of interesting meat of it all, just to place the work in a theoretical framework. As I'm sure you're quite familiar with already, moral injury is importantly distinct from PTSD. And it is mostly distinct because it's not a violation of a sense of safety, as PTSD is, but rather a violation of one's sense of morality and ethics. As we know, PTSD and moral injury can occur alongside each other, but it's not necessary. And moral injury in particular generates guilt, shame, and moral disorientation, in contrast to PTSD that instills a sense of fear. Traditionally, moral injury has referred to individual acts or the non-acting, but it can also extend to institutional acts in conflict with values. So just to illustrate that, a very, very basic example would, of course, be a soldier killing a civilian that is innocent, which is one of the kind of more classical prompts for a sense of moral injury, as it violates one's own sense of, one's own duty, of course, to preserve the life of others. It could also be the non-acting, so the non-intervention when something like this happens, the inability to prevent violence against the civilian who is innocent. But moral injury has increasingly also been extended as a concept to institutional acts in conflict with values. One of the classical examples here is, for instance, gender-based violence within the army. How do female personnel feel about that? That could constitute a moral injury because they represent an institution that at the same time violates deeply held moral values about what's right and what's wrong. And so I'm placing the moral injury sustained in relation to the treatment of Afghan interpreters in that latter realm, institutional acts that are in conflict with values. The suggestion has been made by some people that moral injury has perhaps been even deeper and more profound among soldiers who weren't conscripted but who signed up voluntarily. Because if you sign up voluntarily, of course, for a war, you commit to that. You haven't been forced into the act. And if you then become part of actions that violate your deeply held ethical views, the injury may be even more profound. I think that is something that we can intuitively understand. Now, what is perhaps slightly different from some of the other lectures that have been part of this series is that this research project that I present today situates itself specifically at the nexus of a more political and international relations literature on moral injury that is not very extensive, but it's growing, and some of the literature that exists on veteran activism, which again is not very extensive, but there is some history of that, especially in relation to veterans speaking out against the war in Vietnam. Now, just to illustrate a bit more concretely what I mean here in my work in terms of moving away from a more clinical or psychological understanding of moral injury towards a more political understanding, which is not denying at all the importance of a psychological or clinical understanding or religious understanding. It's just the way I'm using it here, is to look at this particular example. So I'm drawing here, first of all, on the work of Schrader, who says, a soldier will not experience moral injury unless they critically examine different factors of the event and then find the circumstances tied to that event immoral. And again, this is a helpful way, I think, to distinguish it from PTSD, which is a very, often a very immediate shock response, whereas here, even if it's not as conscious, there must be something to sustain a moral injury. There must be some form of reflection, whether about the event, in order to judge it, to assess it against one's own sense of morality. And I think you can see a kernel of political critique emerging from this definition. Another quote of El Hai is also useful to understand this. She's quite critical of some of the more clinical conflations of moral injury with PTSD that she sometimes sees, especially in the US context. And she intervenes in that debate by saying, the concept of moral injury is political and ethically Janus-faced. Its advocates do not speak the language of political critique that was at the core of a Vietnam-era articulation of the trauma of perpetration, of having committed atrocities, of the kinds of militarism, racism, and imperial power that made such acts possible in the first place and made the war in Vietnam as a whole both possible and a crime. I understand that there may be different understandings of the Vietnam War, but what I'm trying to do here is just to kind of mobilize this quote to think again about how indeed moral injury could be cast in the language of political critique, and kind of maybe draw on what was more explicit in the Vietnam era and see if we can remobilize that again in relation to Afghanistan. So as I said, we know these examples from Vietnam veterans against the war, where soldiers saw or did certain things or failed to do certain things, which indeed caused a certain moral injury, which they channeled into political engagement. Now, I would like to contrast that briefly to a moment in the UK, which comes from a Defence Select Committee report from our UK Parliament that was published earlier this year in 2023 on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I know the report inside out, also because, as you may know, when a Defence Select Committee report is compiled, there's normally a call for oral and for written evidence. And the Sula Alliance submitted written evidence, and I was invited alongside one of the veteran co-founders of the organization to also give oral evidence. But the hearings also included veteran mental health charities, even General Petraeus, also Ben Wallace, the former defense minister. And when the report came out earlier in 2023, there was an observation about the mental health of veterans in light of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And at least, as you can see here, that the manner of the withdrawal from Afghanistan had a very serious impact on the mental health of veterans at the time. And as you can see, there is a language of moral injury that is also used. Many veterans contacted the charity Combat Stress because they were suffering from moral injury, with some feeling let down and angry. And it said that the withdrawal reactivated past trauma with a re-triggering of PTSD for some. You then also see that the response of the Ministry of Defense in the UK was to have a kind of mental health summit, to make more funding available to mental health charities for veterans. And while this is, of course, incredibly important, we may suggest that more is needed to address the moral injury that is documented in this report. So this is chapter 3, 55, 56, and you can see how in point 57, there's something really interesting emerging in the report. Point 57 notes that the Defense Secretary argued that successfully evacuating Afghans who work with the UK mission was important to veterans' mental health, and I would argue for alleviating moral injury. And it said for many veterans, this is part of closure. This is part of the sense that we cannot do anything about the political situation that unfolded. We cannot save Afghanistan. What we can do is we can stand by those people who stood by us. That will not satisfy all veterans, but those are the sorts of things that help veterans through mental health issues and help them come to terms with the other sacrifices that they have had to make. So Ben Wallace here is documenting the kind of helplessness experienced by many Afghanistan veterans and saying that in the face of that helplessness, one of the things that has supported veterans' mental health is to see that certain Afghans who stood by us, interpreters and other locally employed staff, have been successfully evacuated. The report, however, continues to say that the Select Committee agrees with Ben Wallace's assessment, but it follows from his observation that veterans' mental health will be negatively affected by those Afghans who still were left behind, because as we know, post August 2021, unfortunately, all countries still left some of their locally engaged staff behind. So even though there's this recognition in this report that what happens with local staff affects veterans' mental health, what we see as the solution on the previous slide is simply channeling money to mental health support, and we do not see a commitment to get more people out of the country. And so I'm trying to kind of see how the political element of this is important to avoid individualizing and psychologizing the issue as if it is only something that an individual has to come to terms with, but to place it in a more structural political context. So let me just briefly summarize my arguments, and then I give a range of illustrations. The first argument is that for some veterans, moral injury can become an impetus for political engagement. So it's not something that they would only speak to a counselor about or to their family or their close ones about. It's something that they channel into political engagement. This political engagement, I argue, can offer a really important form of moral healing, which is potentially complementing other forms of moral injury. For some people, it can replace other interventions, but it's something that we need to keep in mind, that this is another outlet which is really important for people. It has supported and it can support some veterans in alleviating their sense of personal guilt and helps them to come to terms with their own moral position, and in that sense help them to, let's say, morally redeem themselves. At the same time, this is complex because the political engagement that is fueled by moral injury simultaneously is likely to deepen the original moral injury. So we have a contradiction here. On the one hand, political engagement can help heal a moral injury. At the same time, through the political engagement, soldiers and veterans are exposed to and confronted with further injustices that often deepens the original moral injury that activated their political engagement in the first place. And I will show in a moment how this operates. So moral injury, as I said, can form an impetus for political engagement. And I try to distinguish here between a kind of spark and the fuel for political engagement. So the spark is the immediate event or the immediate encounter that may have provided, the kind of first impetus for political engagement. But often there's something else, something bigger that fuels continued political engagement. So what sparks the activism in the first place? It's often, social bonds that are linked to very specific individuals. Just to illustrate this, many of the organizations that I showed on the earlier slide have come about because one particular veteran had built a very close friendship with one particular Afghan interpreter. And they felt committed to that one specific individual. And that commitment to that particular individual, who they felt was not protected, was not given the rights they deserved, sparked their activism and engagement in the first place. A good example is visible on this slide. This is one of the co-founders, again, of the organization that I co-founded in the UK at Aitken, together with his interpreter. His interpreter was lucky enough to, in 2016-17 already, be brought to the UK under an earlier resettlement scheme. But the post-resettlement support he and others were given by the UK government was severely lacking. And when my colleague at Aitken realized how unsupported his former interpreter was, he started being further involved in this issue. Another co-founder of mine received a phone call one day where his mate told him that his former interpreter was facing deportation and that there was a court case fighting his rejection as an asylum seeker in the UK, and that was what initially kind of put it on the radar for him. But also in the US, the organization No One Left Behind is sparked by the specific bond that Matt Zeller, the founder, had with his interpreter, Sharis Jinwari, who saved his life. And he, of course, felt very committed to that. With some others, there's not that very specific social bond that sparks their activism, but it can be a kind of lingering trauma, and I will give an example of that on the next slide. So these are examples of what sparks the activism, but there is then also something that needs to sustain the activism, that fuels the further activism. And this could indeed be a discovery of structural injustices through supporting this one individual that people may not have been aware of before. I also think it's important to acknowledge that many veterans have a very practical mindset. They learn, and as soldiers, they learn to not come with a problem, but to come with a solution. And so the kind of can-do spirit also sustains some of their continued political engagement. And finally, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, especially for veterans who have just left the army, as we know, there's often kind of searching for meaning in the transition from military to civilian life. The adrenaline-fueled experience of war, the sense that you're part of something bigger, is something that many veterans miss once they transition into civilian life. And this kind of search for meaning, for something bigger than themselves, for something, a principle they can stand for, justice that they can advocate for, is something that further sustains the political engagement. So just to describe some of the social bonds, I have a quote here from a veteran in the UK. And this is a very typical kind of story of Afghanistan vets, although, of course, it's also important not to completely romanticize this or generalize this. Some veterans didn't have close bonds with interpreters. He's describing, so the interpreters joined like press-up competitions, and I also played chess with interpreter X. He kicked my ass every time. I think I beat him once in about 100 games. So they were part of a tight-knit team, and then we were set to leave them behind and say goodbye at the end. It was a bit like leaving one of your soldiers behind. The whole thing is like you never leave anyone behind. And in training, you train and train and train that if somebody gets injured, you do everything to get them out of there, you know. Or if somebody gets killed, you know you fight to get them out. So to leave the interpreters behind felt weird. The only, comfort was that you knew that you were entrusting them to the next person, so to the next incoming tour of duty, who you knew would treat them in the same way. But then, therefore, to leave them behind at the end now, it just feels so wrong. It feels like we have left soldiers behind. Yeah, it feels like we have left Corporal Jones from Cardiff. It feels like we've left him there. It's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. And that really is the motivation, the very strong motivation, I think, for ex-military people who work with interpreters in this way and welcome them into the team and they excelled in the team. So this is really quite different from, let's say, average, or the kind of more mainstream migration activism where people are perhaps interested in refugee struggles in more general terms or in intercultural relations. Here it is much more about a brotherhood, an ethics of no one left behind that grounds the activism in the way that interpreters are seen as one of us. They are not seen as the others, and therefore this commitment is just there. So, given that background, what are then examples that spark political engagement? This is another UK veteran who describes to me that the direct reason was because I was approached by a military colleague who's still serving and therefore didn't feel that comfortable to speak out publicly, who had been contacted by his previous military interpreter, who was a failed asylum seeker in the UK, and he explained that he had failed to qualify for the very limited rules and regulations that the Ministry of Defense had put in place, and he felt this was wrong. As I was then out of the military, he wondered whether I would be willing to take the thing up. So this veteran is then explaining that the approach by his colleague triggered something else. What it did do is trigger off for me earlier conversations that I'd had while I was still serving and issues that had arisen over treatment of our interpreters, which had concerned me at the time, and in all honesty, they'd perhaps gone to the back of my mind, but they were always there. So this is the kind of lingering sense of unease, a moral injury that is not quite fully realized, but lingering in the background that gets reactivated the moment he is approached by his colleague about Afghan interpreters. Very specifically, in 2010, he describes a very particular incident occurred where one of our interpreters had been very badly injured in a bombing incident, and he actually lost 3 of his limbs. And if he had been a British soldier at the time, he would have been evacuated back to the UK and then gone through a sort of long-term intermediate care package. But nothing like that was on offer for him. And the attitude that I perceived that was that we would try and do our best to pack this guy off and hand him over basically broken goods back into the, clearly inadequate Afghan system. I was concerned that we weren't applying the same standards to that individual as we were applying to our own people, who would be injured. And I felt that was wrong, and that always rankled and irritated me. That also kind of sat with me as something in the back of my mind. So really what happened when my colleagues contacted me, all these things kind of triggered off, and I thought, right, I need to get involved. And I started researching the then policy that was in place, and it became very obvious to me from my own perspective that it was inadequate. But like I said, the spark for political engagement is not enough to sustain the type of political engagement we have witnessed among some of those veterans, and so we need to look at what fuels their engagement longer term. And as I said, it's often the case that the initial engagement with one particular case, with one particular former interpreter, suddenly opens people's eyes to the bigger structural issue. An example of that is Matt Zeller, who, as I said, was the founder of No One Left Behind, who, as I said, did everything to get his personal interpreter who saved his life to safety in the US. He picked him up from the airport. He noticed he had just one suitcase and nothing else with him. And he was just dumbfounded by the lack of support that was there on arrival. And so he describes It was at the airport that I learned how little we as a country, and again, as a citizen of this country by extension, how we as the people, how very little we actually do for folks like him. I learned at that moment that our country's approach to resettling refugees is that we outsource the problem to an amalgamation of religious and secular non-profits, and we hope for the best. And they're under-resourced and overburdened. So in the case of Metzeler, what he did was that he picked up Janice, his interpreter. He had already some media attention to the case that he had generated when he was supporting Janice. And kind of on a whim, while standing at the airport, he just did a kind of public call to raise some money to make the post-resettlement phase for Janice a little bit easier. And he was surprisingly successful in raising money, through those television channels. So a few days later, he happily drove to Janice's new place and said, Janice, it's really great. I collected so much money for you, raised a lot of funds. You don't have to worry about the next year of your life. Just kind of settle here, settle with your family. We pay your rent. Everything is sorted. And it was Janice, his interpreter, who said, thanks, Metzeler, but there are so many other Afghan interpreters still in Afghanistan. So this is not enough. Let's continue our fight. And so they together founded No One Left Behind. Now, we cannot, I think, not mention in this presentation the impact of the NATO withdrawal and the moral re-wounding that has occurred in that context. And I just want to give some examples here of what, again, refueled some of the Afghanistan vets' engagement. This is a quote from a German veteran who messaged me in already actually before August 2021. This must be June or July, when the German troops withdrew from Mazar-e-Sharif. And he sent me a message and he said, at least our Afghan former interpreter X was with a journalist in the tower, watching the last planes take off and fly away. What a moment of glory for German foreign and security policy. I can hardly drink whiskey in the needed speed to numb my moral pain. So you see here the German troops leaving in the night without any prior warning, leaving this interpreter behind. But also here, there's a quote from a Swedish veteran who describes to me, I guess I was also more affected than I thought I would be. It's hard to try to figure out yourself what you invested and how you did it, but obviously I did invest, and obviously it did not only catch my attention, but it felt like I was punched, not in the face, but in the stomach. Not hard enough for me to fall on the ground crying, but hard enough for me to really feel it. And I was like that for many days in a row, like I was punched in the stomach in the morning every day. But I mean, I was still functioning and I was still working, and I still spent all my evenings and weekends communicating with Afghanistan. And I felt really bad because we just had a daughter, our firstborn, and I spent less time with her than I would do if that wouldn't have happened in Afghanistan. And some veterans indeed explicitly use the language of moral injury to describe how they viewed the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan in the manner in which the withdrawal in the end occurred. And you see some examples here from Germany here on the top left. I read often in these hours and days that many veterans are re-traumatized, and I can tell you why. We're morally injured. Moral injury is a category in the psyche. And the fatal thing is that we have not been injured by the actions of the Taliban. We have been morally injured by our own government, and that is shameful. Metzeler again in 2022, asking whether the president will mention the fact that the left behind Afghan allies have generated a profound moral injury. A UK veteran in the right bottom talking about the Defense Select Committee report that I showed earlier, which talks about moral injury and the failure to evacuate Afghans, but doesn't really connect the two, saying this is akin to plastering over a wound without recognizing its origins. It's amateur, short-term, and shameful. And then in the right top, you see an Australian veteran who decided to burn his former medals in an act of protest and present the remains to a federal member of parliament to show his profound moral injury with the hashtag Save Our Afghan Terps. I checked in with the Australian veteran, asking him how he felt afterwards. And I was like, I hope you're okay. And he said, actually, it felt liberating what I did today, which perhaps also speaks to this idea of moral redemption. By burning those medals, he could recover something of himself and felt liberated in his own spirit. So I'm finishing up here. This is I think one to final slide. In terms of the implications of this, on an individual level, we can see that political engagement that is initially sparked and then subsequently fueled by moral injury can provide meaning to people who search for meaning in the aftermath of a war they have been part of, which they have either sustained a moral injury in or subsequently feel they sustained a moral injury in the aftermath of that war. And I sometimes think of the veterans and soldiers that I interview as men or women on a mission, because it often becomes something that is completely absorbing to them, that they are extremely, extremely focused on. And so there's still a sense of a continued notion of being on a mission, but then channeled into this political advocacy. And that, of course, also unsurprisingly leads to a sense of activist burnout, which is how we would call it in the more social movement literature. But you could also, of course, just call it burnout in the more clinical literature, where sometimes the self and also others, close others, family members, like the daughter that was mentioned by the Swedish veteran, are neglected. And it is very common that veterans tell me stories about how family members are slightly perturbed by how much time people spend on this engagement, how they are sometimes even hiding for family members, how much time they're spending on it. And it also creates a sense of isolation, sometimes from the military community, if they feel like they're one of the few people who speak out on this issue. And as I said, the individuals that I primarily interview are people who are leading advocates in their country. So they're only a part of a handful, or sometimes the only single one in each country. And so they feel very isolated within the political arena there. And I've had conversations with veterans when I brought them together, and they met each other from different countries, that they said to me, we're so grateful to meet each other, because I really thought I was crazy. But now, I was the only one in Australia who was so vocal. Now I've met somebody in Canada, and I finally know it's not me, it's the world that is crazy. There is this question of whether indeed this political engagement gives indeed some form of redemption. This is a quote from a veteran who said, I got implicated in the lie of the Australian government in this case, that Afghan interpreters would be protected, that we would take care of that. I'm not a liar. So for him, it is really important holding on to that identity of not being a liar, that he does fulfill the promise to Afghan interpreters to bring them to safety. Sorry. But there are also more structural questions we can ask. Potentially, some of the engagement on Afghan interpreters could be understood as a kind of selective outrage. We know that the frustration about what happened in Afghanistan is very broad, is very substantive. And so there's a question of whether some veterans, some soldiers, seek to right one tangible wrong in an otherwise overwhelming situation. They can't change what has happened in Afghanistan. They can't change the direction of the country. So they focus on one very specific thing. And their outrage is then also channeled in on that very particular topic, which may affect the ways in which a more structural critique could be developed. And excuse the language, I'm just trying to, we know that it is important we know that swearing is an important part of military culture. So this is One of the quotes that comes from one of the soldiers who describes how he has to what he has done there, and he sees his work as doing that. But it's largely maintained certain ideologies regarding the state as the protector. It also doesn't always lead to questioning militarism and Western intervention more broadly in the way that we would perhaps have seen in relation to Vietnam. Finally, if you're interested in more resources, these are just a few of the publications I've written in the past few years. There are some more that you can find when you just Google my name. But this just gives an indication of some titles. As I said, you can also Google the exhibition that I created with the veteran and photographer Andy Barnham called We Are Here Because You Were There. There's a virtual version of it that you can visit online. If you're interested in hearing more about the UK organization Sula Alliance that advocates on behalf of Afghan interpreters who work for the British Army, there's the website. And finally, there's a comparative report called Divided and Leaving Together, which compares the resettlement schemes and treatment of Afghan interpreters in 8 different countries in the phase before August 2021, during the evacuation, and in the post-August 2021 phase. So if you're interested, you can check that out as well. I really look forward to questions, and I'm also always open to getting any emails, so please feel free to send me emails with questions as well. Thank you.